This came out of Meta this week, which announced a bunch of changes to the way that Instagram users who are teenagers will experience the platform. And I think it's worth talking about because so much energy right now and attention are going into trying to solve the problems faced by teenagers and young people on social media. And there's been all kinds of proposals from, banning teens from social media to, getting phones out of schools to just trying to change the mechanics of the platforms themselves. And this was a really ambitious and potentially overdue series of changes that Instagram rolled out.
All right. So what is the news? Well, as of this week, any young person who tries to create an account on Instagram will find that their account is now private by default. So in the past, if you were 15, 16, you could decide to just have a public account on Instagram. Anybody could follow you. Anybody could message you. Well, now the way it's going to be is that your account is private by default. And if you're under 16 and want to make your account public, you're going to have to get the permission of a parent or guardian and link their account to yours. And potentially even more jarringly, though, anyone under 16 on Instagram who already has an account, within the next 60 days, Meta is going to just start switching their accounts to private. So with the exception of some 16 and 17-year-olds, basically there are just not going to be many public teen accounts on Instagram unless those teens, after this happens, go to their parent or guardian and say, I want to make my account public, and they get their permission to do that.
That's so interesting. I mean, there's going to be a mass freak out when that happens. But what if the parent doesn't have Instagram? Like, how do you get your parents' permission if they're not on Instagram?
You have to get your parent or guardian to download Instagram. So there is not really a workaround for this. And, of course, we imagine that teens are going to try to find workarounds. It's like maybe they'll just be like, I don't know, the cool adult in high school who agrees to be everybody's fake Instagram parent. But Instagram told me, no, that's not going to be possible. We're going to be monitoring for that sort of thing and try to make sure that it's not, one parent to 50 different accounts.
That's so interesting. Yeah. What are the other changes?
So there's a lot of them. In addition to making accounts private, teens are going to be placed in the strictest possible messaging settings. So we see a lot of scams and harm come from the fact that, strangers will try to interact with teens who they don't already know. Meta says that's not going to happen as much anymore. They are also going to be filtering out a lot of words from direct message requests that might be sort of bullying or harmful. There's going to be a new notification after you've been on the app for 60 minutes a day if you're a teenager that encourages you to take a break. And there's going to be a sleep mode, which will turn off all Instagram notifications between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. And all of these settings, if you are under 16, you can only change those with your parents' permission. There is also a feature that will let parents see which accounts their children have been messaging. They won't be able to see the contents of the messages, but they'll at least know who their teens are talking to. Yeah.
So I have a sort of basic question about all this.
Yeah.
Which is, as we know, a lot of teenagers lie about their age on the internet because they know that these sorts of controls and settings exist. And so we know that a lot of people who are younger than, 16 or 17, maybe they're 10 or 11, they will say, I'm 18 in order to sort of get past the age blocking features on some of these platforms. So is Instagram dealing with that at all?
Yeah, so they are developing a range of new strategies to go after this problem. It includes things like looking at who all your friends are. If all of your friends are 16 and maybe, your profile says that you attend a certain high school, but, your Instagram account says that you're 24 years old, Instagram is going to come in and say, hey, can you actually show us your ID and prove that you're 24? So they're going to be doing things like that to try to prevent that from happening.
If you're constantly saying things like Riz, it'll flag you. It'll say you're definitely not a 38-year-old man.
Really? Or are they going to say you are a 38-year-old man who's just trying to sound cool on a podcast?
Yeah, that's probably more likely.
Yeah.
So first, I just want to ask, about the sort of the strategy here.
Yeah.
Is Meta trying to get out in front of regulation by basically announcing these changes that might be mandated by state or federal laws soon anyway?
Well, I think Meta has already been run over the regulation train here, right? It was in 2021 that the whistleblower Frances Haugen came forward with some internal research, which said that there were people inside of Meta who were pointing out some of the negative effects that using Instagram had on mental health for some teenage girls. And that just sparked a huge investigation by most of the states in the United States. And last fall, after a 2-year investigation, 41 of those states and the District of Columbia sued Meta, claiming that Instagram was addictive and harmful. So that was sort of the moment when this went from, a theoretical problem for Meta to a real one. And, Kevin, just this month, most of those same states came forward and endorsed the U.S. Surgeon General's call for a warning label on social media saying using this stuff can actually be harmful for your kids. So I think in some important ways, it feels like Meta already lost this fight, right? Does it feel that way to you?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly feels like this is something that Meta did not want to do, that it would not have done absent pressure from regulators and lawmakers. But, I think a lot of parents are probably going to be grateful for this. A lot of, teenagers are probably going to be upset about it. I do think maybe there's going to be like a wave of teenagers, making themselves look older with fake accounts. Like, I just think the actual implementation is where a lot of my questions are. And also just how this is going to be treated by parents. I remember the Washington Post did a story earlier this year about these parental controls that existed on Instagram before all of this. And they found that only like a single-digit percentage of parents actually use these parental controls at all.
Yeah, and Nick Clegg, who runs policy at Meta, made a very similar observation that despite the fact that they have built these tools, they're not used. But I have a lot of empathy for parents here because there are a lot of apps on your teenager's phone, right? And there are a lot of social apps, right? In addition to Instagram, I'm going to bet most teens have TikTok on their phone. I'm going to bet most of them have Snapchat on their phone. And we currently live in this world where parents are expected to go into the settings of every single one of those apps, maybe set different time limits for each of those apps, look at who their teens are messaging on all of those apps. And that is a big burden to place on parents who already have a million other things to do. So I think it makes a lot of sense that most parents are not doing this and that you did actually want to see some kind of intervention at the product level that said, hey, we're Meta, this is our product, and we're going to take care of this stuff for you by default.
Yeah. How are people viewing this inside Meta? Like, is this something that they feel they can kind of give away and it's not going to affect their actual usage that much because teens will still be able to use Instagram even if their accounts are set to default private? Or is this something that they actually think could take a bite out of how many teenagers are using Instagram?
So this week I talked to Naomi Gleit, who is one of the longest serving Meta employees. She joined in 2005. Her title now is head of product, and she's been working on this. And she told me that Instagram does expect that they will see less usage by teenagers in the short term because of this change. Because when you look at what they're doing, they are introducing real hurdles into using Instagram. And even for the teenagers who are already using it, they're going to say, why don't you use this less? In a way, if teenagers were using it more after this, it might be a sign that the changes weren't working, right?
Yeah. So say I'm 14 and I have an Instagram account and, I have maybe a couple hundred followers, mostly people from my school, but I have a public account. I want people to be able to follow me. And I get this, notification at some point from Instagram that says, hey, we're going to make your account private, right, unless you get your parents' permission. Can I then just go in and sort of into my settings and say, actually, I'm 18 now, and it will sort of grant me that ability to remain public?
That might work in the short term, but Instagram has told me they're on the lookout for that thing, right? Like if you were 14 today and 60 days from now you suddenly become 18, they do have a way of keeping track of that. There's a database.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be the easiest thing in the world to game, but could I just sign up for another account and say that I'm 18 and then sort of try to move all my followers over to that?
Well, this is something else that social networks have a lot of experience with, because something that happens on something like Instagram is that someone gets banned and they think, well, no problem, I'll set up a new account. And so they have to invest a lot of resources into stopping what they call ban evasion. So this would be a similar thing where if you start creating a bunch of new accounts, they would be able to look at your IP address, for example, and a bunch of other signals, right? I mean, Instagram was straightforward with me. They said some people are going to be able to get around this, but when you're talking about improving child safety online, you just want to take harm reduction seriously, right? Like the goal here is not to solve every single problem that happens on a social network. It is to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am sort of pretty cynical from years of covering this company and sort of watching how it rolls out new features in response to various pressures from regulators and parents and, the public. And I remember one Meta employee telling me once that Meta is a company that will eventually usually do the right thing, but only after exhausting all other options. And so to me, this does feel like an example of, they tried a bunch of things. They got all this pressure from regulators and lawmakers to do something about teen safety on Instagram. And so before they were sort of required to by law, they kind of roll out these changes, some of which may be pretty cosmetic, some of which may be more meaningful, but this is basically them trying to claim that they have done something so that the next time Mark Zuckerberg or Adam Mosseri gets hauled in front of Congress, they can point to these things and say, look at all the things we've already done.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is fair. I think if they wanted to do all of this stuff 5 years ago, they could have, and they chose not to, and they were dragged into it kicking and screaming. I think it's also really interesting, Kevin, to just look at the things that they are not doing, right? There are some states, including in New York, where we recently interviewed Governor Hochul, where they want to get rid of all algorithmic recommendations, right? Like they think that teenagers will be better off if they can only see a reverse chronological feed, which, by the way, I think that idea is insane, but it's incredibly common in some of these state legislatures. Meta is not doing that. And I also want to say that even though I think there will be a lot of good that will come from preventing strangers from like contacting random teenagers on Instagram, a lot of the worst bullying that kids receive is happening inside of their schools, right? And if you follow your bully on Instagram, they will be able to take a video of you falling down the stairs and tagging you and having everybody laugh at you. So there is still
Does this happen to you? It sounds very personal to you.
I actually did fall down the stairs when I was in accepting award middle school.
Really?
But the thing was, it was not actually that traumatic for me. I remember my teacher came up to me afterwards. She was like, "I'm so sorry. You must be so embarrassed." And I was like, I'm a tall person. Like I'm constantly tripping. Like I'm not taking it that personally.
And if you're out there listening and you went to middle school with Casey and you have video of him falling down the stairs, please send it to heartfork@nytimes.com.
It was only like a partial fall. You know what I mean? It was like I didn't actually like roll down an entire flight of stairs like a cartoon.
Let's review the footage and see what happened. Casey, one concern that you've brought up a couple times on the show is about what happens to teens from more marginalized groups if some of these changes to social media actually go through. And whether, for example, a gay or a trans teenager or young person who wants to sort of express themselves on the internet in a way that maybe their parents don't approve of, how something like parental consent or notification would affect them. So do you think these new changes on Instagram pose any risk to certain types of teens who may not want their parents to have to click through a bunch of approval screens to let them keep using Instagram?
I think there's definitely some risk to that, and we're going to have to see how it plays out. My sense is that teens will still be able to explore topics like LGBT issues even in this world, right? Because people, again, LGBT teens, for example, will be able to make their accounts public if, for example, they want to share about their experience and if they have a supportive parent. And, maybe you're a kid who doesn't have a supportive parent, but hopefully you will be able to go on Instagram Reels if you want to and, search for other LGBT teens like yourself and maybe see some of that. So I think that is actually probably going to be okay. And honestly, like probably strikes a nice balance. One of the other changes that Instagram is making here is after getting a lot of criticism about showing kids content related to eating disorders, for example, or other stuff that sort of might drive them to dark places, Instagram is now going to go to teens and say, here are some like basically safe topics that we can show you. Like, you want to see cats? We'll show you all the cats that you want. I'm very curious if they would put LGBT issues in that list of 30 or so things that they pick. My assumption would be that they wouldn't, but as long as kids can still kind of search and find what they're looking for, my hope is that social media will still be there to make them feel a little bit less alone.
Do you think this is going to be meaningful? Like, do you think this is actually going to make teens safer on the internet?
I think in one particular way, yes, which is this issue of strangers contacting kids online and getting them to make huge mistakes is very real. There have been so many investigations this year into these sextortion schemes. They're financially motivated, where you have these gangs of criminals who will contact random teenagers, trick them into sharing nudes and then blackmailing them. This has been linked to at least 20 suicides and just kind of huge misery all around the country. This really does shut that down, I think, in some very important ways. Not to say that it could never happen again, but it will be very difficult to do on Instagram now. So I think that that is a really good thing. Now, is the mental health of teenagers going to improve miraculously over the next year as all of a sudden all their Instagram accounts are made private? No, I don't think so. What do you think about some of the other changes, like sending them a notification after they've been using it for an hour, or halting notifications when they're supposed to be at sleep?
I think that's all fine and good. Like, I don't think that they're gonna. I mean, they're not going to lock teenagers out of Instagram during the hours that they're supposed to be sleeping. They'll just stop sending them notifications. But there may be ways around that too. So I just think we'll have to see. Teenagers are very clever historically at getting around restrictions imposed on their internet use, whether it's by their parents or by the social media company itself. So I think it's just going to be fascinating to see whether teenagers are actually impacted enough by this for it to matter, and whether they'll sort of find some clever workarounds.
Yeah, I'm sure some of them will. Private by default is a pretty big step forward in terms of reducing the visibility of young people on a platform. And I do wonder whether Meta will be able to get some goodwill from the lawmakers and the regulators that are so mad at them right now.
Yeah. Are regulators sort of happy about these changes? Do they feel like their concerns are being addressed?
Well, I haven't heard from a lot of regulators, but I have heard from a bunch of advocacy organizations that work on child safety, and they were all over my inbox this week basically saying this is not good enough, this is pure PR, right? A lot of these advocacy organizations are pushing for what they call safety by design, or a duty of care. They want to see it in the law that this should not be a sort of industry-led volunteer project, but that legally they have to put kids into the strictest messaging settings by default, and they have to restrict the way their personal data is used. So, and by the way, I think there is something to that, right? I think that this is important enough that we probably should just not leave it to the goodwill of these for-profit corporations to decide what happens to kids online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we'll wait and see how this goes. When is it rolling out again?
So if you're a teenager, you create an Instagram account this week, you will be placed into the private experience. But for the rest of teens, it is going to roll out in about 2 months, let's say.
Yeah. I just want to say, like, as a closing thought to this story, like, pressure works, right? These pressure campaigns from parents, from lawmakers, from teachers, from just concerned citizens, they actually do in some sense force companies to do the right thing.
And that's why it's so important to complain online. If you're not complaining online, start.
It's true.
Yeah.
You can change the world.
Yeah, what are you mad about? Change it. Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.